recipient of the 14th James R. Killian Jr. Faculty Achievement Award. This award honors at one and the same time two people, Dr. James Killian, former president and longtime patriot of MIT, who I'm happy to see is in the audience today, and this year's recipient of the award, Professor Franco Modigliani. Now, this year's Killian Award may be unique in one respect. I believe that it is the first time that the recipient has received the Nobel Prize in the same year as the Killian Award. Now, we would like to think that it was Dr. Modigliani's receipt of the Killian Award that persuaded the Nobel Committee to make him their choice. If I may digress for just a moment before getting to the serious part of my purpose for being on the podium, let me mention just a story or two about his visit to Sweden last December when he went to receive the Nobel Prize. I asked his wife, Serena Modigliani, who's here, whether the Festival of St. Lucia had been celebrated while they were there. And indeed it had been. Now, the custom is roughly this: for young maidens to appear in one's room at dawn on the festival day with candles. Now, fortunately, the Modiglianis were at a reception with the King and Queen of Sweden the night before, and the lovely Queen of Sweden was able tactfully to hint to Franco that he should be sure to wear pajamas the next night. Another trial to which Nobelists are evidently subject is a roundup by Swedish students who oblige each Nobelist to sing in turn, and then they award a prize. And I'm happy to report that Franco won the prize. This has then been an active year for Professor Modigliani. Rather than review the distinguished career that led him to this point in his life cycle, let me refer you to an account that's in your program, and now let me, however, sum it up in reading the citation, which goes as follows. The president and faculty of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have the honor to present the James R. Killian Jr. Faculty Achievement Award to Franco Modigliani, and to announce his appointment as Killian Award Lecturer for the academic year 1985-1986, in recognition of extraordinary accomplishments in the social sciences. His contributions to macroeconomic theory and to finance are foundations on which generations of scholars and policymakers continue to build. His pursuit of understanding in the dark complexities of social life and his generous encouragement of others in this pursuit exemplify all that is best in MIT intellectual life and colleagueship. Professor Modigliani, may I present you with this citation? And now, may I introduce the first of Professor Modigliani's two lectures. The overall title of these lectures is The Determinants of Individual Thrift and National Wealth. The first lecture is titled The Life Cycle Hypothesis, and the second, which will be given in 10-250 next Wednesday at this time, is titled Application of the Life Cycle Hypothesis to Policy Issues. I'm delighted to present Professor Modigliani for the first lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here today. I'm a little tense. This is an important day for me. I hope that gives me a chance to explain to so many non-economists that there is something to economics, that it is not all idle chat. And of course, it has been an incredible year for me. In this year, in which I have reached 2/3 of a century into my life cycle. It's been extraordinary because I have been bestowed with 2 awards. First, the most coveted and prestigious award given by the most prestigious university in the world, namely the Killian Award. And then the Nobel Prize, which is the most prestigious award, period. They came in quick succession. And it was good that they did, because in the interim, some bad things were going on in my mind, which I have kept as a secret, but now I must confess. When I received the Killian Award, I was, of course, happy, but I had a gnawing feeling that I did not deserve it, that there must have been something wrong with that committee. I was passé, I was shop-worn. Why would they ever want to give me the award? Were they incompetent? Didn't seem likely. Looking at the names, didn't seem like Suzanne Berger is an incompetent person. You can think of many things, but not that. So what must have happened, I thought, is that they were negligent. They overrated me, and they goofed. But then, within a couple of weeks or a few weeks, I got the Nobel. And contrary to the hypothesis that was made by Mr. Potter, I thought that it was very unlikely that the Nobel people gave me the award just because the Killian had done. And so I had to agree that there was an independent set of judgments of great minds that decided that I was worth it. And then I started thinking back of what I had thought, and I decided that maybe, after all, it was I who had goofed. I have since many times apologized in my heart for having thought of the Killian Committee as being incompetent. And of course, if I had read this very detailed explanation here, perhaps I would have known better. But I did not have the fortune of receiving this until now. Now, what I want to talk about is, in general, the determinants of saving behavior, of saving and accumulation, if you like, of individuals and of nations. What determines the saving of a person? What determines the saving of a whole country? This is a very old topic in economics, one that is regarded as being very important because, as everybody knows, saving is the basis on which we are able to make investments, that is, to build factories, to build machines, to build tools that make man's labor more productive. It is essentially, as economists say, an important factor of production, and it contributes to the productivity of man. This very old view, I will now shift to here, this very old view, I'm going to lay out here, this is the outline of which I will be speaking. So you know where I am. When I'm through, when I'm talking about something, I will mark it. No, that's not a marker. That's not a marker. Sorry, I have the marker here. I will mark it so you know where I am. I am talking about introduction. And you can see it there. Now, when this subject, this interest in saving, however, is in reality rather more recent. It really goes mostly to the years of the Great Depression and the years and the period following it, due to the influence of the Depression and of Keynes. Specifically, what happened is that the traditional view that saving was a very important contributor to human welfare, it was a virtuous thing, and you know that in all religions, in every ethical tradition, saving is an ethical thing to do. It's a good thing to do. That each person should save a good fraction of his income every year. This point of view got suddenly changed with a new interest in saving when, during the Great Depression, Keynes wrote the general theory. Because he pointed out that saving is good if whenever people save more, there is immediately more investment to replace it. If there is less consumption, people save more, they consume less, but there is more investment to take the place. But what if investment does not take the place of an increased saving? Well, this is what Keynes was concerned with. He described a number of reasons why this may not occur. And some of these reasons were generally valid, but many of them were very specific to the Great Depression. There were things happening at that time that are not generally true and made the possibility quite real that more saving would lead to less, not to more investment, but simply to less income, and because it was not be replaced by other activity. So this was the concern, and this led to a great deal of interest in what determined saving. And particularly, we came out of the war with the feeling that the problem of there being too much saving, which was true during the Depression, might really be a universal truth in the future. It was on this principle that there was a school called the stagnationist school that was particularly concerned with the danger of oversaving. And this danger was seen to come from two considerations. One, that there was not seem to be much need for investment anymore. All the big investment, the railroads, the big things had been done. And so there was no need for the great investments. On the other hand, as people got richer, they would be saving more and more, a larger and larger fraction of income. The second part reflects, the second statement, saving a larger and larger fraction of income, reflects the view of the saving process that was going on, very broadly accepted, during the late 30s, early 40s, and 50s, based on what Keynes himself had said. Keynes has some very general, some very famous propositions about saving, which essentially say that the only thing you can say for sure about saving is that if income rises, people will save more, but less than the increase in income. Or as economists say, the propensity to save is a number between 0 and 1. Now, that was the basis, and it laid emphasis on the notion that income mattered, and it also laid somehow less emphasis, but still some emphasis, on the notion that as income rose, people not only would save more, but would save proportionately more. And of course, that would mean that poor countries would save less than rich countries and all the related inferences. Now, that study, and I have now covered the role of thrift in the Keynesian evolution and early Keynesian theories of the determining of saving. That's what I'm talking about now. That particular view got tremendous acceptance. It was generally agreed that saving depended essentially on income, and that the relation between saving and income could be described by a linear function, most likely with a negative intercept. That view was based not only on Keynes' writing, but also on empirical evidence. Imagine yourself being in the 1950, when this problem all came to a heading, and observing what had happened in the United States over the previous period, which was the only period from 1929 through the war, but you knew the war years shouldn't be counted because they were distorted. So you could look at the peacetime period, 29 to 41. And that is what you could see if you looked at the data. What I've graphed in there is a graph of the real income against real saving. Now, real simply means that I have not taken the dollar saving, but I have adjusted them for purchasing power, so they measure the purchasing power of the income and the purchasing power of the saving. Now, you see, first of all, that 1929 which is the peak of the cycle, was large saving, relatively speaking. You see what happened as people got poorer, they saved less and less and less, 35, 34, 32. Finally, saving got negative, okay? Then there was a pickup again, thanks God, and saving again began to grow, and they grew in 34, they grew in 35. I mentioned them at the wrong time. From 31, you jump to 32, 33, then 34 and 35, now they keep rising. And they rise again to 36 and 37 and 39. Look at 40, and boom, there is 41. Look at the gigantic saving. Now you see that if you take a regression line, if you fit by least squares a regression, you get a line which I have drawn there. That line has a mammoth negative intercept. That intercept is minus 30, which is roughly a fourth of the mean value of the variable. What does that mean? It means that you have here, as you can see from the graph itself, a relation between saving and income which is not one of proportionality. As saving rises, the saving rate increases. The saving rate is the slope of a line from the origin to the point. And you can see, in particular, that there is some income, the famous break-even income, at which you are poor enough, so you save nothing. And there you see it. It's roughly what occurs around 1931, around 31, 32. Okay? And that was the story. And there was nothing else to say. Very good fit, fits very well. Now you take that line and extrapolate it to the present. The present income is sort of way past that curtain. And imagine what kind of saving rate we would be, 30% or something like that. Just for your information, the saving rate today is about 3%. Okay? But we'll get there. That 3%, by the way, is a fake. It's really higher than that. But the official figure is 3%. Now, what can we say? What can one say about this theory? It was an incredibly naive theory, incredibly naive, because a moment of reflection could have shown that that theory could not be true, could not be describing the world forever. For instance, if you go back to that graph for a moment, you would find that this was 29, but that the income, let's say, of 1900 was here, and the income of 1860 was way down here. Were we saving 15% of our income in 1860, or in 1870, or in 1880? And if we were saving 15% of our income, how in heaven did this country get built? On this saving? Clearly, something was wrong. Similarly, the other basic source of data was looking at the behavior of individuals. You had budget studies. Budget studies are essentially, you use information from inquiries made to individuals to obtain information on their income and their saving. And you can make a graph like that. And that graph looks exactly like that. There is a break-even income, which is close to mean income. And below that, people they save, and above that, they save. So it all fitted. But nobody asked himself the following question. Suppose that the person is always, all the time, to the left of the break-even. Can he go on this saving forever? That is a trick which nobody has invented. In our world, you cannot be saved unless you have saved first, or very rarely you can borrow and be a net debtor, but most of the time, you cannot have negative wealth, let alone growing negative wealth. So there was something wrong with this model. And somewhere around the early 50s, there began to develop a series of criticism of the simple notion and a series of facts which were inconsistent with the simple notion. First of all, this is what I refer to here as 3 landmark empirical studies. The first was a study that answered the question as to what happened in 1860. That study was made by Kuznets and others, and Kuznets got a very simple, elegant result that people in 1860 were saving as much or more than in 1929, and people in 1880 were saving as much. Roughly speaking, throughout the period he studied, which ended in the late 50s, in the mid-50s, people saved about 10 to 11% of income, 10, 12% of income, from the very beginning of the data available. Okay? So you had something to explain there. That's fact number one. Fact number two was the following, that there were two great women, one unfortunately dead, Dorothy Brady, the other alive, Rose Friedman, the wife of Milton Friedman, who did a study of budget, of these budget studies. They looked at the budget studies, not for 1 year, but for all the budget studies that were available as of 1950. This was roughly 1950. And when you did that, they found something very fascinating, which I will try to draw. I don't have a drawing for that, but I will try to give you an idea of what happened. Let us suppose that you have saving here and income there, and you have one of these lines. And that, let us say, was the line for the latest year, 1920. If you got to an earlier year, you found the same line, but the line was shifted like this. Sorry, I'm covering, is that right? Yes. Okay, 1910. Okay, and that occurred systematically. Every successive shift, every successive survey was higher than the previous one. All of them steep lines, all of them had this break-even point, but all of them higher and higher. Now, that meant, if you look at that at face value, it meant that people were getting less and less thrifty, less and less virtuous as time went on. Because at this level of income, in 1910, they saved so much, but in 1920, only so much. So you could have explained the whole thing by a theory of decadence. People were getting more and more and more decadent, but they were smarter than that. And what they showed is, first of all, they observed that the break-even point seemed to be always close to the mean income of that particular year. And what they showed is that if instead of scaling income as dollars, you scaled income as a percent of mean income, all the lines collapse together. Okay? You can sort of visualize, I mean, not exactly, but all this problem disappeared. So what that said was that saving depended not on income, not on how many millions of pennies you had, but on relative income. The rich guy is the guy that has 10 times as much as the average. The miserable guy is one that has 1/10 the average, regardless if the average is $1 or 300 billion. Now, this second study and the first produced some interesting preoccupation among scholars, and there were attempts at fitting them into the framework of Keynes. And I am partly responsible for having tried that until I saw the light. But essentially, there was work done by Jim Dusenberry and myself simultaneously and independently, in which we tried to explain that phenomenon. First of all, Jim was concerned with explaining the relative income, and he said essentially, consumption is a function of relative income, and he gave an explanation for that. And the explanation is an ingenious one. It doesn't happen to be true, but it's an ingenious one. And the explanation is that the rich people, they have no constraint. They are so rich, they can consume what they want. So they buy the new gimmicks, they buy the new cars, and they buy the house in the country and so on. And the people behind them, who are less rich, feel the pressure of these beautiful new gadgets. And they are forced to buy them, even though they don't quite have the income. And because they buy the gadgets, they don't save. And so the poorer they are, the less they save. Now, this explanation, one reason why it cannot work, you can see immediately, is that it doesn't tell you what happens to the guy who is always poor. Does he go on borrowing and borrowing and borrowing to buy a car and to buy elegant foods and elegant things? Fortunately, he can't. Even if he wanted to, he cannot imitate the rich because he ain't got the resources. So, but the other part was to explain why it was that the saving rate had been rising, moving so fast with income during the Depression, and yet in 1860 it was the same as it was then. And that explanation was given by both of us by using the notion that consumption depends on income and the highest previous income. Now, the highest previous income has the virtue that as the income, the economy develops, it moves with you. So that the saving rate always moves, the whole line moves together with the developing economy. So you have a steep line, but that line, just like in the budget equations, in the budget studies, moves with you. That explanation I gave most of the emphasis on the consideration that the relation between current income and the highest previous income can be taken as a measure of cyclical position of the economy. When the income is below previous peak, the economy is depressed. No matter what the level of income is, whenever the income is much above the previous peak, then the economy is elated, and it cannot be much above actually because it can't develop that fast. So I said, in effect, saving is a cyclical variable. There is this saving in 32 because that's deep depression. There is saving in 29 because that's peak. And Dusenberry made more reference to the highest previous peak as a mechanical fact of memory. People keep remembering what they consumed in 29, and they base their consumption on what they remember then. Now, whatever the explanation is, these were the attempts at salvaging the framework, the Keynesian framework. Then there came a third study, and the third study is one by another great woman, Margaret Reed. She's now 80. She lives in Chicago. She gave me a ring recently asking me if I would help her with some very new things that she's doing. She's full of pep, full of ideas. And she is the person that has inspired both my work and the work of Milton Friedman on the consumption function. What she pointed out was that the steepness of the line, that the line essentially which you have seen there, which applies to budget study, in a budget study, the steepness of the line depends on the variability of income. That if income is very stable, the line will almost go through the origin, that is, saving will be proportional to income. If the income is very, very variable, then the line will be very steep. So farmers will appear to save a lot more at the margin than city people, even though on the average they may not save more, but the line is being much steeper, you get this higher margin propensity. And the reason, she said, is, and this of course is the key to what follows, the reason is that people base their consumption not on income, as Keynes said, but on, quote, permanent income, end quote. What is permanent income? Permanent income is the income you expect to earn over your life, all right? An estimate, the best estimate you make of what you can afford, what standard of living you can afford. You choose a standard of living, and then if income fluctuates cyclically or fluctuates for personal reasons, you don't let that interfere with your consumption. So people who are transitorily poor will tend to be saved. This explanation then says farmers who have a tremendously variable income will have a tremendous amount of saving when their income is high because it's far away from the normal, and very much the saving when income is low because it's very far away from their normal. So she prepared the notion for the next step. In my own career, in my own development, the next step was the development of the life cycle theory. This is a work which I began circa 1950, 51, together with a very young graduate student and colleague by the name of Richard Bromberg, and which we developed over a period of 2 or 3 years. Before I get into the substance, I think it might interest you to know that, from the point of view of intellectual history, that when I went to the University of Illinois in 1950, I was in charge of a project called Expectation and Business Fluctuations. Well, it turned out that that project itself never produced a great deal, a book or two, but not a great deal. but that in the course of that project, I learned a lot of things which were the seeds that then grew. One of the important things I learned was that the main reason, the main ways the expectations were used in production planning was to smooth out sales. It is costly to smooth out production. It is costly to let production go up and down. You would like to have it as even as possible. You make a forecast of what you will sell this year, and you don't let the production fluctuate seasonally, but you smooth out the production. Well, that idea, which still has been being pursued by many other people, is the foundation of the life cycle, which says people base their consumption on the income they can afford, on the forecast and history of the income they can afford over life. And they smooth out the ups and downs that come from, first of all, short-term things like disease, unemployment, and the long-term things like being young and being old. When you're old, you're poor. And that essentially a person saves when he's rich relative to himself. The standard of richness is yourself. A person dissaves when he is poor relative to himself. Retired people are very poor relative to themselves. So retired people you would expect to dissave. And of course, to a large extent, they do. Now, but this, we were able to derive this, and this was, I think, a good piece of luck, in a sense, not from another piece of ad hocery like Keynes, who simply said, income, I affirm the following proposition as being obvious, but there was no theory. We went back to economic theory and started from the notion that people are rational. They plan their consumption rationally over life. Now, the theory of allocation of resources is well developed by economists. Economists particularly spend a lot of time in our classes, in our introductory courses, talking about how a consumer allocates his resources over many commodities. In the life cycle, the consumer allocates his resources over many periods. Each period corresponds to a commodity. So we assume that this allocation is done optimally. Now, what from this follows an immediate, dramatic, and important consequence. When you look at the equation that says what does consumption in year one depend to, you will find that it depends on life income, because that is the budget constraint. So immediately we got away from the Keynes consumption depends on income to consumption depends on life income. Now, then, from then on, that was already a very important proposition, and turns out to be the same as the thing on which Milton Friedman was working, so-called permanent income hypothesis, which said exactly the same thing, with exactly the same inspiration, and he also assumed a rational allocation. The difference between, and I will mention it here now because we'll have few occasions to come back to Milton Friedman, his permanent income hypothesis is quite close in many ways to mine. What is the difference? The difference is very simple. In our model, a crucial role is played by the fact that there is a life which is varied in its nature. There is a youth, there is a middle age, there is a retirement, and there is a death. And that is a very solid fact. Okay. What does Milton do? Well, he simply says conveniently that life is infinite. So in his model, the allocation is over infinite life. Now, one can show, I know that the laymen are inclined to frequently to laugh at this. There is nothing wrong. We make that assumption all along. The problem is that for many purposes, it makes no difference. For purposes of short-run analysis, whether you're going to live another 10 years or another infinity of years makes really no difference. But there are points in which the finiteness of life is absolutely crucial, and you will see in a moment why. Now, here comes a next observation of a methodological nature. There are two styles of theorists. There are those who strive for generality and those who strive for specialty. The guy that strives for generality derives a theorem, and under that theorem anything can happen because it's so general. The guy like me just likes the opposite. I like to make a very special, whatever assumptions are needed, justified as well as I can, so that I narrow down very much what is true under the model, so I can reject it. Because the model will now have very concrete specification of what will happen if you change this or that, which I can reject by observations. So I am a non-generalist. And what we did was to introduce a few assumptions, just 2 or 3, but they were pretty crucial. And the first assumption was that, seemed reasonable, that a guy allocating consumption over life, by and large, wants it smooth. That it's very unlikely that a person wants to plan his life in such a way that he will drink champagne when he's young. He will eat just soup when he's in the middle age, and then he'll eat steak when he's old. I would imagine that if you can afford to eat hamburger every day, that's what you aim for. Of course, there are fringes and the like, but fundamentally, you would expect a person to choose a smooth path, which is not necessarily level. It could be a growing path, but certainly a smooth path. Now, to that assumption, we added a few other postulates in order to derive what we have since called the stripped-down version of the LCH. The way essentially I want to go is to have very restrictive assumptions, show that these assumptions give predictions about the world which are largely true, and then ask myself, what would happen if I relax the assumptions? But first, let's start from the convenient simplifying assumptions. So the next assumption which we made was that people left no bequests. And in the earliest version, we even said the interest rate is 0. Now, all these are very easy to relax, but it was just convenient. Why is it so convenient? Because if you have a level consumption and no interest rate, then the behavior of saving and wealth over life becomes very, very simple and very easy to understand. And let me exhibit to you what exactly it becomes. Now I'll try not to cover it by moving over here. We assume that the person has a constant income. That income is, I couldn't find the income. Okay. The person has a constant income, Y bar, and he wants to plan a constant consumption over life, even though income ceases at the age of retirement. So there has this income to retirement, 0 thereafter. And he wants to plan a constant consumption. That constant consumption is given by the broken line here. Okay? What will then happen to the saving? The saving is the difference between income when he earns it and consumption. So this period piece here is saving. And what you get here is that saving is constant through the life until he retires, at which point he has huge saving. Now, you can readily work out the following proposition, that if I made the income larger, say twice as large, then everything would be twice as large, the saving would be twice as large, but the saving rate would be the same. In this world, the saving rate does not depend on how rich you are. The saving rate is the same for everybody of a given age. It's very different for people of different ages. Secondly, what happens to wealth? Well, wealth, as we all know being at MIT, wealth is the integral of saving. It's the cumulant of saving. So if you save at a constant rate, wealth is rising at a constant rate, it keeps rising till the peak, which is at retirement, at which time it begins to come down at this rate, which is much larger, so the line is steeper. So you see how we can learn something very simple. I mean, it has very strong implications of this nature. Now, what sort of implication came from this? Well, there were two kinds of implications. One implication was about individual behavior. Now, remember that on that graph, if you describe a person's actual life, then his income, instead of being constant, is wobbling. And it has a wave. It starts, the income rises with age, then declines with age. So instead of a constant income, we can allow for a non-stable constant income. But what will happen in an event is the fact that consumption will depend on permanent income, and therefore saving will depend very much on whether you're rich or poor relative to yourself. Retired people who are poor relative to themselves are greatly savers. People who are rich relative to themselves are savers. If you have a good year, you save a lot because you don't change your consumption standard. If you have a bad year, you save a lot. So saving is mostly related to the transitory aspect of income. Now, this is an aspect that has very many implications. One can show then that why, for instance, the budget lines are a biased measure of the relation between saving and income, because essentially they measure the relation between saving and transitory income, not between saving and permanent income. And if you correct for that, you find that you tend to have proportionality, at least within limits. I will not go any further into this, because this is the part of the theory which is common to the theory of Milton Friedman. He also calls it permanent income. I am willing to call it life resources. He calls it permanent income. Either one will do. He says deviation of income from permanent income is transitory income. Fine. I'm willing to call it transitory income, but I call attention to the fact that in his model, all transitory income is essentially in the nature of a random shock. In my model, that is not true, because there is a transitory component which is very long-lasting, that connected with the cycle of life. Okay? You are constantly poor in the first 30 years of your life, and you are constantly poor in the last 50 years of in the last 20 years of your life. And in between, there is a period when you're richer. So there is transitory, but transitory in a very different sense. Now, we are now ready to attack some of the implications, namely the really interesting implications. So I want to shift out now from the implications about individual behavior to the implications about aggregate behavior. And it is here, of course, that the life cycle theory has really paid the greatest dividends, and it's completely different from Milton. What the life cycle theory implies, and let me tell you immediately what it's the punchline, is that the saving of a country is not dependent just on the saving of the individuals, in the sense that if you have two countries in which the individuals behave identically, one for one, there may be 1 million people, each of them over his life cycle has identical behavior. Will the two countries save the same? No, says the life cycle. They will not. If one is growing, the other is not. The one that grows will save more. The faster it grows, the more it saves. And let me demonstrate this result. For this purpose, we can perhaps find it useful to go back to this graph. Imagine that you have a community of people all like that. And remember that I can generalize that appreciably, but just for the sake of simplicity, all the people are like that, although some are richer, some are poorer, but they all have the same life cycle behavior. Now, I say, and suppose that in this community, population is constant and productivity is constant. So there is no growth either from population or from productivity. I say, in that society, saving is 0. Why? Because the integral of this area of saving, there are all these people who are saving, and the integral of that area is exactly equal to the integral of the saving area. So you have 2/3 of the people, or 4/5 of the people are saving, 1/5 is this saving, and the net is 0. Okay? Now let's have exactly the same people, exactly the same thing, but population is growing. What's going to happen? There are more people who are young than people that are old. Therefore, more people that are saving than people that are dissaving, and the balance is going to be positive. If population is growing fast, there's going to be even more young people, therefore even more saving. I hope that this is clear and obvious. Second, consider the case in which population is stationary, but there is productivity growth. This is the more interesting case, it's a little more intricate. The result is the same, but for another reason. In a society which grows, the young are rich, the poor, the old are poor. That's obvious, because the young have grown to a society which has been e to the power O2 times t more productive. Okay? So if they are born 20 years later, they find that their productivity is, over their life, is 30% higher than than their parents. But now, if the young are rich and the old are poor, what happens is that the young are saving like rich people save, and the poor and the old are dissaving like poor people do. The saving of the rich exceeds the dissaving of the poor, even though over his own life, everybody will consume everything. So productivity growth, just like population growth, produces the effect of a increasing saving, produces saving, and saving depends on growth. Now, there is, these are essentially the essential two cases. There happens to be a coincidence, which is sort of fortuitously useful, that when Richard Bloomberg and I computed the saving rate for a 3% population growth and the 3% productivity growth, lo and behold, the numbers turned out to be the same, just about the same. We were puzzled and found that the function, saving as a function of R and population growth, saving as a function of R and productivity growth, really are a lot different. But in the range, which is very small for the function, from 0 to 3%, they produce the same number. Okay? So you can then say to a first approximation, what matters is growth, no matter where it comes from. Now, there is another way to look at the result, that growth is the dominant factor. And the other way to look at it is the following. You have that wealth. Now think of the community as a whole. There is an aggregate amount of wealth. If the economy is stationary, the wealth will be constant. Okay? But suppose the economy is growing and people behave this way, then the wealth will grow exactly at the same pace as income. So if income grows 5% per year, wealth will grow 5% per year. But the growth of wealth is simply saving. In fact, saving is exactly saving in a very famous formula, which all students of economics know by heart. I wish I could find in a well-known formula, the relation between saving and growth and wealth is saving is the rate of growth times the stock of wealth. But I'm interested in the saving rate. Oh, very easy. Divide through my income. The saving rate is the rate of growth times the wealth-income ratio. So you see immediately that the larger the growth, that if rho is 0, saving is 0. If rho, the larger is rho, the larger is saving. Now, you've got to be a little careful, because it turns out that A over Y is a function of rho. So when you differentiate, you don't get just A, but you get a second term. It turns out that if you allow that, if you look at saving versus rho, it's not a straight line as it would be if A over Y were a constant, but it is a line like this. That is, it keeps rising with rho, but at a decreasing rate. Now, so we have here two rather conclusions which at the time were absolutely amazing, and people just refused to believe them, I would say. One, a country's saving rate does not depend on how rich it is. A country's saving rate depends on how fast it grows. Well, at the time when this proposition were announced, there was no way of testing them. All we knew was that in the United States, growth had been fairly stable, and the wealth-income ratio had been fairly stable, and it was about the kind of number that came out of our calculation. We calculated that A over Y should be around 5, and sure enough, at that time, Goldsmith produced the first estimate of wealth in the United States, and the wealth-income ratio was about 5. But you can only rely on one country and say, because the growth never changed, the wealth-income ratio and the saving rate never changed. That doesn't seem much satisfactory. It's like saying that in the dark, all the cows are black. But within the next 10 years, we had an enormous flourishing of national income statistics. At that time, by the way, besides the United States, there was the data only for Sweden. That was the only other country for which there was a long series, and it seemed to fit our theory. But since we have been able to compute national income account, at the present time, actually, there are national income accounts are available for 40, 50 countries. Now, not all the same quality, not all for the long length of time. Here I'll show you a sample of 21 OECD countries. These are the advanced countries, the industrialized countries, for which data are reliable, reasonably reliable. I can first take my word that the correlation between the saving rate and income is 0. And it's got to be, because we know that the greatest saver is Japan, who was then particularly a poor country. This refers to data 10 years back. On the other hand, the richest country in the world, the United States, is not saving much. That's enough. Those 2 points are enough to make you very much doubt. And the fact of the matter is, for these countries, there is absolutely no correlation between income and the saving rate. How about the relation between saving rate and growth? Well, here you are. I have, in this graph, you have, I have it right? Yes. In this graph, you have the income graphed on this axis and the saving rate graphed, the rate of growth of income graphed on this axis and the rate of saving graphed on this axis. Now, you see immediately there is a fairly good relation. The circled countries which are named are the big countries, or those that we are more familiar with. You see the United States, it's fall off a little bit, the regression line, but fundamentally the US has a very small saving rate. You see it's one of the lowest. Why? It's the richest country, but doesn't grow very much, as you can see from its position here. Who saves a lot? Japan, which is not particularly rich, especially during this time. This is 1960, 1970, so 25 years ago, but had a hell of a big growth. By far the largest that anybody ever remembers as a stable growth path. Italy, which to everybody's surprise turned out to be a great saver. I remember very well the surprise I myself had when Italy, a country of beggars, coming out of Mussolini's terrific exploitation and beaten up, suddenly began showing up with these huge saving figures. Japan-like saving figures. The reason was Italy was growing like mad. Incidentally, that was in the 1960s. It was growing at the rate of 6%. It was saving 20%. Nowadays, it's growing about 1 or 2, and the saving rate is down to 10. In fact, probably 8. So you can see that the theory had something to say that is reasonably well borne out, and this is by now generally accepted. Now, I've made many such pictures with many different countries. This is just a sample that I had on hand, but in general, there is no question. You can add a few other variables. Why other variables? Well, we are coming now to the next question, which is we have covered the case of steadily growing economies. We have covered empirical verifications, and now we are coming to the effect of dropping simplifying assumptions, which will also lead to other variables possibly being important. Not very important, but possibly having some importance. Well, some of these I don't want to spend much time because they're trivial. It takes nothing. You don't need zero interest rate. It's just that it makes calculation simple. You have summations instead of present value of annuities. And that just happens to be easier. But you can certainly work with present value of annuities. And nothing specially happens except one important thing. What happens in the life cycle model if the interest rate goes from 5 to 6? Will people save more or will people save less? Well, the answer to that question is that, as it should be, you cannot tell. Because, as it works out, there is a substitution and income effect. You can show that the higher interest rate makes people richer. And to this extent, makes them consume more and save less. Okay. On the other hand, and this comes out perfectly clearly out of this model, I just don't want to take the time because it's getting kind of late, on the other hand, there is a substitution effect. That is, people are induced to consume later because consuming later is cheaper. If they are sensitive to allocation over time, then they may shift enough to compensate the income effect. But offhand, the life cycle cannot tell you. Now, empirically, I can tell you that the work I've done suggests that the income effect dominates, so that a higher interest rate makes for a higher consumption, that is, for a lower saving. And that's the important point. Higher interest rate makes for lower saving. Now, this is counterintuitive for many people, but let me really assure you that there is nothing wrong with this conclusion, and it's, in fact, may even be true. Now, well, let me just go through one more, and then the next time we'll finish the rest. What can you say about the fact that this theory was originally, as it first came out, did not mention family size. And in fact, it has been labeled by one of our critics the bachelor theory of saving. But of course, that criticism was unfair because it was very easy to introduce a family size. And essentially, what our model then says is that the way the person computes his consumption is the following. Take the total number of habitants of the family over the life cycle. Parents for the first 10 years or the first 2 years, whatever it is, parents and children for the next 20 years, parents alone for the remaining years. And if you want, you can weight the children as being less than 1. That's an easy thing to do. Then this aggregate is divided by the total resources, and it's the per capita consumption. And then, to establish the consumption at any point, you multiply by those present at any point. Now, one of the interesting implications of this, which has been verified again and again, today I found some recent verification, is the following. Suppose you take two people who have the same age, both people retired, in fact, 70. Okay, both people are retired. Both had the same life income. One had 5 children, the other had none. If our theory is correct, the guy that had 5 children will have less wealth. Why? because his consumption over the retired period is smaller than the guy who had no children, since he was one of 4 who was consuming, okay? So you would expect him to have a smaller consumption, and since the wealth serves to provide for the retirement, you would expect to have less wealth. This turns out to be absolutely true. It's been shown again and again that people with more children have less wealth than people with less children. I think, if you don't mind, I'm sure that you have had enough. You have your head full of life cycles and the rest, and I'll give you a break until next Wednesday. Thank you.